Boa tarde a todos e todas. Sejam muito bem-vindos a mais um evento do Laboratório de Estudos do Romance, dessa vez o último do nosso ano. E para fechar com chave de ouro, nós vamos dar início a esse evento em comemoração ao bicentenário do Gustave Flaubert, um escritor muito importante. É uma grande honra ter essa primeira conferência com o professor Jonathan Culler. E para dar início, antes de passar a palavra para ele, eu vou passar só alguns recados em português bem brevemente, lembrando que essa conferência será em inglês, né? E bom, eu sou Rafael Valim, e para a nossa primeira live, eu gostaria só de lembrar, né, um lembrete muito breve, de que se vocês tiverem interesse, por favor, se inscrevam no canal do LERo e aproveitem para dar um like aqui no vídeo, porque isso ajuda demais a compartilhar esse evento, né, e a palavra da literatura para mais pessoas, né. E também, né, para quem está chegando aqui talvez pela primeira vez, vou lembrá-los que o Laboratório de Estudos do Romance é coordenado pelos professores Jorge de Almeida e Sandra Guardini Vasconcelos e chancelado pelo Departamento de Letras Modernas e Departamento de Teoria Literária e Literatura Comparada da USP. Bom, em relação ao certificado para ouvintes, para obter esse certificado é necessário ter no mínimo 75% de presença. Então, o evento sobre Flaubert vai ter 4 lives, 2 hoje, 2 amanhã. A segunda live de hoje é às 5. Então, para obter esse certificado, precisa participar de pelo menos 3 das 4 mesas. Ao longo da live, eu vou passar aqui no chat um link, né, para um formulário, e aí vocês preenchem esse formulário para obter a presença dessa live. E ao final do evento, né, eu solicito, por gentileza, que vocês enviem um e-mail para lero@usp.br com o nome completo e título do evento de que participaram, para poder solicitar o certificado. E lembrando que a gente vai emitir o certificado para o evento, a gente não emite certificado para mesas específicas, então é preciso participar de um mínimo completo e título do evento de que participaram. Acho que tem alguém com eco. Ok. E, bom, eu vou então agora passar a palavra para a Elisa, que muito gentilmente ajudou, né, e praticamente tomou a frente na organização do evento do Flaubert, né, e que faz parte do grupo de pesquisa na História do Romance da Unicamp. Então, Elisa, pode ficar à vontade de apresentar o grupo.
Elisa Pagã, Rafael me convidou para enfim, para fazer esse evento. Com muito prazer, eu trabalhei com o Rafael, eu trabalhei com o Léo, foi sendo muito legal a coisa acontecer. Eu estou aqui no DPLS também, e faço parte do grupo História do Romance, que é um grupo de pesquisa do Instituto de Estudos da Linguagem, do IEL, da Unicamp, que é coordenado pelo professor Jefferson Cano. O grupo, as reuniões são abertas, e se alguém quiser mais informação sobre as atividades que a gente organiza e tal, eu vou colocar, acho que nos comentários, os links para o site e para as redes sociais. Mas se alguém quiser dar uma olhada, o grupo chama História do Romance, no Instagram é @História do Romance, no Facebook também. Depois eu deixo mais separadinho ali nos comentários alguns links. Acho que é só isso.
Então, muito obrigado, Elisa. Eu vou, então, passar a palavra para a professora Sandra. Já gostaria de agradecê-la muito por aceitar o convite de mediar essa mesa. E aproveito também para agradecer ao professor Culler. Thank you so much, Professor Culler. It's such an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you so much.
So, thank you. And Professor Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Elisa. Bom, eu vou primeiro saudar aqueles que estão conosco aqui essa tarde em português, e depois eu passo, então, para o inglês para poder apresentar o professor Culler. E já aproveito também para agradecer, né, e também em português, o fato de ele ter aceitado esse convite. É um prazer tê-lo aqui conosco. Well, I'm going to introduce Professor Jonathan Culler. He's now a retired professor, but he was a professor of English and comparative literature at Cornell University. And he has been president of the American Comparative Literature Association, secretary of the American Council of Learned Societies, and chair of the New York Council for the Humanities. And at Cornell, he was chair of the departments of English, Comparative Literature, and Romance Studies. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2001 and to the American Philosophical Society in 2006. Now, Professor Culler has published profusely and widely, and I'm just going to mention some of his major works. I would like to mention Flaubert, Uses of Uncertainty, published in 1974. Structuralist Poetics, Structuralism, Linguistics, and the Study of Literature, published in 1975, which won the Modern Language Association's Nobel Prize. 1997, Literary Theory, a very short introduction, and I'm sure you are all familiar with this publication of his, because this is this short introduction has been translated into Portuguese, and I know that many students in our undergraduate courses have this particular work in their bibliography and are familiar with it. And in 2015, Theory of the Lyric. So just some of the major works among all of those that Professor Culler has published throughout his academic life. So again, Professor Culler, it's a pleasure to have you among us. Thanks very much for accepting to give this paper. And now we are all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Vasconcelos. Can you hear me all right? Is this?
Yes, I can hear you. And I'm also going to disappear. I'm just going to say hello to you, and I'm also going to disappear and leave you the screen to yourself, okay?
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. I realize I don't actually know where you are all located in Brazil. Is it São Paulo or where?
São Paulo. Yeah, well, we are located in São Paulo, but I'm sure there will be people from other states in the country. I've already seen some people. I've already read some of these salutations on the chat, and I've seen that there are people in other places, in other cities, in other states of the country. So
very good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I always enjoy talking about Flaubert, especially Madame Bovary. As you mentioned, my Flaubert, The Uses of Uncertainty was published a long time ago, 1974. My very first book, and I don't think that's me. That's no, that's not. That's my very first book, and in many ways, I was looking at it the other day in preparation for this event, and in many ways, I think it's my books, it's really the one I like the best. I was young, I was imbued with structuralism, I was convinced that all the elder scholars who had written about Flaubert were mostly wrong. So I without hesitation made declarations about how the novel works and what makes Flaubert different. And it seems to me it's clear and lively in ways that some of my later books necessarily are not necessarily. So pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be talking with you on this 200th anniversary of Flaubert's birth. So if you have any interest in Flaubert at all, you've doubtless heard about his ambition to write un livre sur rien, a book about nothing, which is really a very strange ambition, certainly. Here is the famous passage in which he describes this desire in a letter to his mistress in 1852. So if we can start the slides now. That's it. Good. Book about nothing. So this is working. You've all got the slides here, and I can move them. Great. So here's this beginning of this passage from a letter. What seems to me beautiful, what I would like to create, is a book about nothing, a book with no external attachment, which would be self-sustaining thanks to the force of its style, as the earth holds itself in the air without being supported. A book where there would be almost no subject, or where the subject would be almost invisible, if that is possible. The most beautiful works are those in which there is the least matter. And then he continues. Can I do this? Now that should work. There we go, next one. He continues, that's why there are neither noble or ignoble subjects, and why from the standpoint of pure art, one might almost establish it as an axiom that there is no subject, style being in itself an absolute way of seeing things. So in this letter, Flaubert devalues what seem to us the most important aspects, or at least the most obvious aspects of novels, right? I mean, plot, character, structure, theme, moral, etc. He dreams, he says, of writing a novel where one could sort of ignore everything else and would only have to write sentences. So it's a very strange ambition. It's an ambition whose sort of purity and aestheticism became quite influential among writers and theorists in later years, especially in the 20th century, for instance. The distinguished American critic Percy Lubbock, for instance, called Madame Bovary the novel of all novels that the criticism of fiction cannot overlook, because, he writes, it's a book in which the subject is absolutely fixed and determined, so that it may be possible to consider the matter of its treatment with undivided attention. And that subject, of course, is Emma Bovary, whom he says is small and futile, but since as a fixed subject that allows us to focus on the masterful novelistic treatment, her futility is a real value. So this is Lubbock's version of taking up the version of a book about nothing. Emma, for this to be a book about nothing, Emma, its subject must be a non-entity, nothing, rien, who's a non-entity who serves to allow the novelistic treatment, the artistry of the sentences, etc., to take center stage. But for Flaubert himself, I think there's quite a lot of tension around the notion of a book about nothing. I mean, it's the sort of the ideal, but it's one he really can't put into practice. He writes almost every day to Louise Collet, who's off in Paris, and he writes his novel during the day, and then will write long letters to her at night. And he's always complaining about the research he's having to do on a whole series of topics in order to write Madame Bovary. So club feet, because there's a famous incident of the club foot and the operation on the club foot, and pharmacies because of Homais, the pharmacien, and sentimental literature because of Emma's attachment to it and the possibilities it holds for her of fulfillment. So he complains to Louise Collet, for example, that I've had it up to here with the dreams of young girls, les rêves des jeunes filles. He's really oppressed by all this matter that for him turns out to be much more to creating the novel than just writing sentences. On the other hand, the rien of un livre sur rien seems to keep cropping up in connection with the subjects of the novel. So though Emma is the main character, the first part of the book is devoted, as you know, to Charles Bovary, who is introduced as a sort of ridiculous non-entity. I'm sorry, I'm accustomed to just pressing one button, and I have to press a different button to make this work there. So the novel, the opening sentence, as you know, it's narrated in the first person from the perspective of the classmates in his new school. We were in study hall, nous étions à l'étude, etc. And the novel not only recounts the comic scene of Charles' initial reception in the classroom, but goes on to provide a sort of witty, synthesizing description of his father and Charles' previous life. And then it notoriously announces, here in the quotation in the middle of this slide, that it would impossible à aucun de nous de se rien rappeler de lui. That we could remember today, we could remember nothing about him, nothing. And the text then goes on immediately to start telling us more about him. He was a boy of even temperament who played at playtime, worked in school hours, etc. So though we're given lots of information about Charles's life before and after his school years, supposedly given this information by this classmate, the text stresses that the classmates, he's such a non-entity, the classmates could remember nothing about him. Well, this seems another mark of Flaubert's desire for a book about nothing, that he sticks this sort of thing in. The book's subtitle is Mœurs de Province, which suggests that Flaubert thinks of this as his subject. It's hard to translate this phrase. I plugged it into Google and asked what the Portuguese would be, and was given costumes provinciais, or however you say that. I find it's possible to understand written Portuguese, but I find spoken Portuguese impossible, I'm afraid, and I'm sorry about how. Anyway, costumes provinciales. In English, it's an awkward thing to translate. Perhaps provincial way of life, which is a bit strange. How they live in the provinces, maybe, or I think in American English we might say life in the sticks would be a good translation for this. The sticks, they're way out there in the countryside, away from cities. Life in the sticks. But if Mœurs de Province is Flaubert's subject, he really has little interest in how life outside of Paris is being transformed in this period of considerable change in the early 19th century. And here I come back to Rien again. Yes, there we are. He insists, for example, that since the events that will be recounted here, nothing, in fact, has changed in Yonville, the village where Charles and Emma end up. And the opening of part 2, which leads us down the hill into the village of Yonville, a description that includes a series of rather trivial details, including, a withered pear tree over here and things like that. And then immediately goes on to say, there's nothing more to see in Yonville. Il n'y a plus rien, plus ensuite rien à voir à Yonville. So now I don't want to make too much of Flaubert's insertions of these rien, but they seem to happen at sort of whenever he's talking about what might be the subjects of his novel, that Charles is nothing, Yonville is nothing, etc. Let's just say, I don't want to make too much of it, as I say, let's just say that it's not nothing, the insertion of all these nothings. One last example, an interesting one. Again, after Emma's death, Charles, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button here. There we go. On the final page of the book, after much suffering, including the discovery of Emma's letters from her lovers, Léon and Rodolphe, expires on a bench in the garden, sitting in the garden. And we're told that 36 hours later, at the request of the pharmacist, Homais, who is always curious, eager for the advancement of science, Dr. Canivet arrives and does an autopsy. He opened him up and found nothing. So again, when you open Charles up, you find nothing there. There's nothing there. The paragraph ends on a rien, and then quickly, when everything was sold, we moved right on. So in any case. Well, so is Madame Bovary un livre sur rien? For most readers, from the beginning to the present day, it has been rather a book about Emma Bovary, the vividness of whose representation, with all her failings, has been their focus. And from the beginning, the novel has provoked debates about Emma's character and her situation. Charles Baudelaire, who reviewed the novel when it first came out, wrote that despite the author's efforts to write impersonally, Flaubert again advocated impersonality in fiction, he couldn't not infuse the veins of his creature with virile blood. And Madame Bovary remains a man in everything that is most energetic and ambitious about her, but also most pensive, most rêveur, he says, the French. And he concludes that this woman, in truth, or in reality, is very sublime of her kind, in her restricted milieu and with her restricted horizon. So that's Baudelaire in 1857. In our day, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Mario Vargas Llosa says that he wrote his book, The Perpetual Orgy, Madame Bovary and Flaubert, in order, he says, to explore why Madame Bovary stirred me to such profound depths of my being, what it gave me that other stories could not. He writes in that book, he writes of what he calls his unending love affair with Emma. He celebrates her rebellion against her condition and remarks, it's impossible not to admire Emma's capacity for sexual pleasure. So, foolish woman or tragic heroine, weak and futile, or as Lubbock claimed, or energetic and sublime, according to Baudelaire. At any rate, there is a subject here, and not rien. But of course, finally, what is the subject of the book? Modern readers are likely to be very surprised at the account of the novel given by Flaubert's lawyer in the trial. It was upon publication in 1857. It was charged with offense to public morals because of its representation of adultery, etc. And the lawyer defending the book, Maître Sénard, assured the judges that far from being immoral, this was a book with a moral, a definite moral, and the moral of the novel is, wait for it, the moral of the novel is that dangers lie ahead for the girl who receives an education inappropriate to her class. That is, an education, as he says, and I quote, an education above the condition into which she was born. Flaubert is warning us against the dangers of this, and that's the moral of the book. In this case, he claims, let's see the next slide here, yes, that instead of pursuing the destiny that naturally belonged to her, of being brought up for the farm where she ought to live, or in a similar milieu, and as a country girl, she's shown under the irresponsible authority or the reckless authority of a father who had the idea of having her educated in a convent. This woman born on a farm who ought to marry a farmer, a man of the countryside. Here we see her sent to a convent outside her sphere, and that's where she starts reading romance novels and learning things that she should not have been exposed to. So let's try the next slide. I'm sorry, Mr. Flaubert here continues, sought to depict a woman who, instead of trying to settle herself in the condition that is given by her situation, by her birth, instead of trying to make for herself the life that rightfully belongs to her, she remains preoccupied with 1,000 foreign aspirations drawn from an education too elevated for her. So for modern readers, I would guess Sénar's claim would seem very compelling evidence of the problem the novel highlights, the oppressive condition and the lack of opportunities for women in 19th century provincial France. And of course, the tragedy that ensues from Emma's expectation that sentimental literature provides models to be pursued. But this class issue was a genuine concern and worry in the 1850s. I think to put it in a compressed way, I mean, the French Revolution had promised the emancipation of the lower orders, which hadn't yet happened, but which sort of lay there as a promise, a kind of smoldering potentiality, and intensified by the failed revolution of 1848. And at this point, as more and more of the population became able to read, as newspapers and other media proliferated, as urban life, as more concentration in the cities, urban life gained greater allure. Many of Balzac's novels are about provincial people from the provinces wanting to come to Paris. As industrial processes made what had previously been luxury goods more widely available, under all these conditions, the concern that these people would start desiring all the things they could read about and try to sortir de leur condition, as Sénar put it, try to escape, to leave their proper place. This was a genuine social fear, as Sénar's calculated remarks at the trial suggest. He clearly thought he was tapping into a genuine social fear so that Flaubert's book could be seen as more a moral book with a real message. Well, there is a connection with Flaubert's idea of un livre sur rien, a book about a trivial subject. So he writes to Louise Collet in 1953 that if Madame Bovary is successful, I will have demonstrated that in literature there are no beautiful artistic subjects, and that Yvetot, a little village in Normandy, is as good a one as Constantinople, exotic East, etc., and that consequently one can write about any old thing as well as about anything else. So strange expression there, but any n'importe quoi aussi bien que quoi que ce soit. You can write about anything whatsoever as opposed to something in particular, something in particular. If the worth of a work of art does not depend on what has been assumed to be the work of the hero, of its hero or heroine, that is, if a farm girl dissatisfied with her provincial life is as significant a subject for a serious novel as a queen or a princess, does this not imply, though certainly Flaubert doesn't say this, does this not imply the revolutionary notion that one person might be as good as another? His apparently abstract idea that all subjects are equally good certainly seems to suggest a relation to the democratic notion that every human subject is as worthy as another and allowed to have desires. So equality of subjects, equality of desires, and perhaps then equality of votes. So this seems to have been a genuine fear at the moment. The French critic and intellectual historian Jacques Rancière asks, I have a slide for that. Rancière, why was this text from an author of aristocratic sensibilities and cultivating art for art's sake? The book about nothing seems a perfect example of arts for art's sake, right? Why was this immediately denounced as the literary incarnation of democracy? And he argues that Flaubert's reactionary contemporaries clearly perceived the relationship between this sort of democratic realism and the threat of political democracy. Quote, I have a further quote there. The book about nothing was for them democracy in literature, the literary incarnation of the power of gens de rien. So livre sur rien, gens de rien, the people of no account, gens de rien. So is there perhaps a link, he goes on in that last quotation, between Emma Bovary, who tries to discover what is meant by words like happiness, ecstasy, intoxication that she has read in books, and the proletarians who also want to make real the words and wonder what is really meant by liberty, equality, and fraternity or emancipation of workers, those great revolutionary slogans of the revolutionary period, but which have not really given rise to concrete changes in their lives yet. So when Madame Bovary was published, here's an example of what Rancière is thinking of here. The critic Armand de Pontmartin declared Gustave Flaubert means democracy in the novel, and in denouncing egalitarianism run wild, which is rather strange. Madame Bovary is the pathological overexcitement of the senses and the imagination in discontented democracy. The very idea of representing this country girl, Emma Bovary, as discontented and wanting to live in Paris and wanting to go to balls and to acquire elaborate goods seemed a very bad sign to people of this sort. Anyway, well, there is a paradox here. If this is what Madame Bovary was being taken, since Flaubert is by no means a champion of the people or of democracy. I mean, later in life, he called universal suffrage the most ignominious absurdity imaginable, and la plus ignominieuse bêtise qu'on ait rêvé, etc., than anyone had ever thought of. And he famously declared, "I am certainly worth as much as 20 voters from Coissé, from his village in Normandy. Je veux bien 20 électeurs de Coissé." Yet he succeeded in depicting an Emma Bovary who, inspired by books, rebels against her condition and whose choices offer a critique of life as currently set up. So I think it's quite relevant here that the critique of consumer society, of consumer capitalism, begins in 19th century France. It begins as disgust at new forms of experience that the lower classes came to desire. The beginnings of an industrial economy made all various kinds of products more easily available to a larger public, and unleashed new desires, which in turn made people unhappy with the condition of life into which they were born. And this generated both the fear and the complaint that these people were gaining ideas above their station. On one hand, the general complaint, and then also a specific complaint about vulgar and sentimental attempts to bring art into life. Flaubert himself, while clearly sympathizing with Emma's discontent and her desire for other kinds of experiences, clearly explicitly denounces in a letter to Louise Collet the growing desire of large portions of society to bring art into their lives, in a letter that condemns many trends in French life of the modern French life of the time, a rather comical series of things he's condemning, at least for us. It's hard to understand what's supposed to be wrong with many of these things, but here's that slide here. Let's rail against mediocrity seeps in everywhere. Let's rail against gloves of flocked silk. I assume that somehow factories were now able to turn out gloves which previously could only be made by hand or something, against office armchairs. Who knew what's wrong with office armchairs? Perhaps he believed that people who worked in offices should sit on hard stools and shouldn't have comfortable chairs. Against Macintoshes, again. What's wrong with Macintoshes? Against efficient cooking devices. The French is this, it's hard to understand quite what that is. The calefacteur économique, I think that's what it means. Against fake fabrics, against face luxury, fake pride. Industrialism swells the ugly, capitalized to grotesque proportions. How many decent people a century ago could have lived their life perfectly well without the Beaux-Arts, and who now have to have little statuettes, trivial music, trivial literature. Again, not easy to translate those. Petite statuette, petite musique, et petite littérature. Just sort of popular literature, popular music. Just think what horrifying propagation of bad drawings lithography must produce. Now that they can run off lithographs there'll be, the Mona Lisa in everybody's house. What a horrible thought. Anyway, so Flaubert may have deeply sympathized with Emma's unhappiness and boredom, but had no patience with her attempts to decorate the house with what seemed to her genuinely precious luxury goods. So while promoting Emma as a valid subject of literature and equal to others, Flaubert writes against the attempt to democratize art, to make it enter every life, and he renders trivial the manifestations of Emma's this particular democratic subject's desires, as we know. I mean, she sympathizes with the desire, but mocks them, the concrete forms that they take. So the point one must make. So here, the point one must make, I think, is this: that literary democracy, in the sense of equality of literary subjects, and political democracy only intersect in very specific respects, in the disruption of hierarchy, for example, and in the promotion of a principle of equality of subjects. But in that context, Flaubert's novel actually works to delegitimize Emma as a subject, in as much as it mocks her desires and choices. So it's important to stress that I think that Emma's problem is not, as is sometimes said, that she confuses literature and life. Emma knows all too well that her life is not like that which literature has represented. That's precisely the problem. But she's not content to experience sentiments in and as literature only. She's not happy just reading romance novels, not content with reading. She wants to give material form to the affective possibilities to which she has been exposed, to give sort of material realization, shall we say, to her desires. Flaubert himself writes that art in itself is a good thing when you lack everything else. For want of the real, one tries to console oneself by way of fiction. So for him, consolation comes from the experience of language, from reading, from the production of literary affect, and that's lacking everything else. You can take pleasure in literature, and that will supply, console yourself. But practically minded Emma, a farm girl who responds to literary language, who gets excited by the mystique that her romance fiction, sentimental literature creates, wants practically enjoyable ideal pleasures, and is not content simply to read novels. She's not happy just sitting in Tostes or Yonville and reading this fiction. So, despite important exceptions from Baudelaire to Vargas Llosa, the prevailing evaluation of Emma Bovary has generally been negative. She haplessly confuses imagination and reality to a pathological degree, and she sows the seeds of her own destruction. In fact, her character, as you know, gave a name to what was seen as a psychological condition, le Bovarisme, which Jules de Gaultier, in an 1892 book by that name, Le Bovarisme, defined as the human ability to conceive of oneself as other than one is, despite the impossibility of making this image of the self a reality. And thus, so for de Gaultier, a pathological state of self-deception. So is Emma Bovary a psychological type? I think Flaubert seems to have thought so. He wrote, again, I'm relying a lot on his correspondence, but these may have been just, thoughts of a moment, but still, that's what we have, his things that he has declared. He wrote to Louise Collet, "My poor Bovary is doubtless suffering and weeping in 20 French villages at the same time, at this very moment." So as if he sees her less as a distinct individual than as a typical provincial non-entity, that she's all over the place, this Bovary character. And one suspects that he sees the creation of such a type as a genuine accomplishment. I have another slide here. Yes. What distinguishes great geniuses, he writes, is a generalization and creation. They sum up a range of personalities in a type and bring to the consciousness of humanity new characters. But if he sees her as a pitiable type, others, of course, have valued the novel for the vividness, distinctiveness, and yes, even complexity of Emma Bovary. Vargas Llosa writes that Emma's fate is more human and desirable than that of the other women of Yonville, and she has profound experiences that they never will. And certainly she stands out from the other women of the villages, in part, if they are dissatisfied, which they might well be, we're not given access to their thoughts, whereas Flaubert's famous style indirect libre, or free indirect speech, enables us to participate in her experience. So for anyone not familiar with the technique, basically, you have direct speech, like, oh, how depressed I am, direct quotation. Indirect speech, you change the pronoun from first to third, and you change the tense from to past, and you with a reporting frame, like she said. So instead of how depressed I am, she said to herself how depressed she was, etc. That's indirect speech. And then free indirect speech keeps the shift in pronoun and the shift in tense, but preserves the marks of speech or thought, like the O or something. While omitting the frame of report. Oh, how depressed she was. Sort of a weird construction, isn't it? It could potentially be the narrator who is telling us, oh, how depressed she was, but the O suggests that this is actually the speech or the thought of the character in question. It seems informal and therefore a report of speech. So here's a particularly splendid passage in the novel when Emma is at the performance of the opera Lucia di Lammermoor with Charles, and so long passage. But I put the style indirect libre parts that seem style indirect libre in bold when we are getting Emma's thoughts in some direct fashion, as it were. So, sorry. Lucy advanced. Lucy came forward, half supported by her women, a wreath of orange blossoms in her hair and paler than the white of her gown. Emma was dreaming of her wedding day. She saw herself at home again amidst the wheat in the little path as they walked to the church. Oh, why then that had she not, like this woman, resisted, implored? She, on the contrary, had been joyful, oblivious of the abyss into which she was throwing herself. Ah, if only in the freshness of her beauty before the defilement of marriage and the disillusions of adultery, she could have anchored her life upon some great, strong heart. Then, with virtue, tenderness, and voluptuousness and duty blending together, she would never have fallen from so high a happiness. So in this passage, Flaubert moves from the narrative report of what is happening in the theater to Emma's in a description of what Emma is doing. She's dreaming of her wedding day, to Emma's thoughts, where the O and the ah seem to indicate that this is no longer the discourse of a narrator, but what's happening in her mind. This is a particularly striking passage, since we see shifts in Emma's thinking as she recalls the past, indulging in her conceptions of bliss, but then recognizing her deceptions, her disappointment. And then the passage continues with her recognition of her illusions, and even feel her feelings of disdain about them. Next passage there. Yes. So the previous phrase ended, she would have never, if only there had been some great lover, a strong heart, she would never have fallen from so high a happiness. But this happiness, no doubt, was a lie invented for the despair of all desire. She now knew the pettiness of the passions that art exaggerated. So we have the shift back, it seems, out of her own thoughts to the description of what's happening. So struggling to divert her thoughts, Emma resolved now to see in this reproduction of her sorrows no more than a plastic fantasy, good only to please the eye. And she was even smiling to herself in disdainful pity when, at the back of the stage, under the velvet hangings, a man appeared in a black cloak. It's the hero of the opera. So Flaubert shifted from report of what was happening into Emma's thought, and then back again to report on her resolution, when suddenly the romantic hero appears on stage and she will become carried away once again, wanting to run off with him, how great it would be to go off with him, etc. Anyway, this paragraph it's really a dazzling instance of the narrator's shifting of perspective with such techniques where it's often unclear exactly whose language we are experiencing, the characters or a narrator's. Flaubert provides powerful representations of her ennui, her sense of entrapment, and her fantasies of happiness and escape. So however foolish the posited alternatives prove to be, here it's sort of the desire for the sense of being anchored her life upon some great strong heart where virtue, tenderness, voluptuousness, and duty would all be blended together, etc. In other cases, it's wanting to become a saint and buying amulets and anyway, etc. You've encountered many of these examples before. However foolish the posited alternatives prove to be, her dissatisfaction carries great weight for readers, male as well as female, since we have partly been led to experience it through the mechanism of free and direct speech. Now, Emma herself quite plausibly blames her dissatisfaction on the condition of women in her world. A man, at least, she says, is free. He can experience different passions, different lands. He has possibilities of action and escape. Although Flaubert had no interest in the emancipation of women or other progressive movements, one critic writes that strikingly, Flaubert in this novel takes and defines the reality of the social world from women. So Emma as point of repère, as it were, breaks and defines the reality of the social world from women, from Emma, grasps her as the key point for questioning that world and demonstrating its oppressive mediocrity, even though, as I say, we're always brought up short by doubts about the specific forms her imagined alternatives take. So Emma is both a source of value and relentlessly satirized, and that complicated, complex combination seems to be a major accomplishment of the book. Well, while readers have focused above all on Emma, an engaging character whose nature and situation is, as I say, open to debate. Is she a foolish woman or a tragic heroine, neither or both, etc.? Flaubert's idea of un livre sur rien, a book where the elimination, or almost of the subject would foreground the novelistic art, has had, as I mentioned, a considerable posterity. The great American novelist Henry James, who saw Flaubert's protagonists as weak vessels, he complained more bitterly about Frédéric Moreau of L'Éducation Sentimentale than about Emma, but he wrote that and so he is really taking part in that sense of the novel about nothing has become what makes this great. That Madame Bovary has a perfection that not only stamps it, but that makes it stand almost alone. It holds itself with such a supreme, unapproachable assurance as both excites and defies judgment. And he concludes that, he concludes that Flaubert is the novelist's novelist, and for many of our tribe at large, the novelist. So we can stop screen sharing now and come back to give me the whole screen if you can. That's good. Thank you. Yes. So the reasons for this reputation are not far to seek. Flaubert succeeded in creating a myth of the novelist as supreme artist, with a supreme artist with a fatal attraction to the art of language. His letters especially give us this image of the novelist not as an entertainer, not as a teller of stories, but as an obsessional devotee of le mot juste, of writing the perfect sentence. It's actually quite a complicated image or conception. The novelist is not seen as an inspired bard, not like an epic poet. He is a craftsman, obsessional about the details of the construction of the art object, but he's not feeling very frustrated in this, but he's not a craftsman whose special skill enables him to produce the desired object like a fine piece of furniture. Most craftsmen you expect to be able to do what they're expected, complete the process. On the contrary, for him, the artistic process is a commitment to strive for an impossible perfection. The artist labors mightily day and night, but produces little. He's always boasting about how how he's only today been able to write 2 sentences or something. To be immensely productive, like Balzac, his contemporary, would be to abandon any title to real artistic integrity. Balzac was churning out these novels like mad, etc. In this hyperbolic condition, laboring for days to produce a few sentences becomes a mark of one's artistic calling, if not genius. So, sacrificing himself on the altar of art, the Flaubertian artist is often in agony, but agony comes not from the experience of the world, as, say, for a romantic poet, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, and you're translating this into the your experience of life into your poetry or into your art. But that's not the case for the Flaubertian artist. It's inexpressibility, which was once a property of feelings or a mark of profundity, and becomes really an aspect of the creative act itself, of an endless quest. So the notion of a book with no subject that would hold itself up by the force of its style has played an important role in modern thinking about literature, with theorists like Maurice Blanchot, for instance. But fortunately for us, I would say, Madame Bovary is not a book about nothing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. When you started talking and thinking about your title, I was here, remembering a few things, remembering the trial, remembering the all the letters in which Flaubert wrote extensively about writing the novel, etc. So how could it be a book about nothing, right? I mean, it couldn't be a book about nothing. Yes. Interesting that you should have given it this title, and so it in the end it's very ironic, isn't it, that he uses the word so frequently, and then it all comes out as such a big thing and such a big novel, so much written about it, so much discussed about it. And I kept thinking while you were talking also about how Joyce was such an admirer of Flaubert, and how important Flaubert was to Joyce. And interesting also that I would like you to comment on something else, maybe. If considering all the letters he's written about his own writing and his processes and all that, would you consider that he could also be seen as a kind of theorist of the novel?
Certainly, yes, he's certainly been taken that way. People read the letters and the lesson. Now I think the notion of it sort of merges with the notion of art for art's sake, and also, of course, with certain modern conceptions that are not necessarily art for art's sake, but where protagonists are, where people choose to write novels about protagonists who are completely ordinary people who have nothing distinctive about them, shall we say, or nothing, or maybe something unusual, but nothing particularly admirable or particularly remarkable about them, which is certainly fairly common. They don't have to be heroes or tragic figures. I think even more than, and certainly this is a notion that tempts Flaubert, even more than Madame Bovary, I think Éducation sentimentale. In Madame Emma is a more dramatic character, shall we say, than Frédéric Moreau, who's really kind of more banal, less interesting. Éducation sentimentale is a great novel. I don't like it as much as Madame Bovary. I think.
Oh, really? I enjoy it very much.
One can certainly admire the artistry, admire the sort of anti-hero aspect of it. But Emma gives a different kind of complication to it. But I think that's right, that Flaubert was indeed really the source of what has become a fairly common idea, even if it's not directly associated with something like art for art's sake. It's the notion that we can write that novels needn't have heroes who are remarkably intelligent or remarkably brave or have exciting adventures, but who just simply the psychology of ordinary people, for example, becomes relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, and it reminded me of Bloom, exactly as you were talking, right? I mean, such an ordinary man, and I think I can see, you know, why. I mean, of course, I've never thought about this, but once you have mentioned it, right? I mean, how much they are similar in that sense. I mean, flawed characters, nothing unusual, extraordinary about them. It's very, very interesting. And also,
the great difference there is that Joyce makes use of all this elaborate mythological references in order to make it an exciting novel, whereas Flaubert is sticking to a certain kind of realism that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it's strange that, you know, I always find, you know, I really admire the work of Lukács, for example, his theory of the novel, but I find it very, very strange. You know, I said to sort of I cannot really understand. Of course, I can understand the argument, but I mean, the criticism of Flaubert's what he calls a descriptive type of novel. I mean, I can't really accept that sort of argument. Once you have actually mentioned, you know, Emma as a type, and as a type, she's I think she's a full-blown character, very well developed. I mean, a three-dimensional character, but also a type in many ways. And in that sense, I mean, I think Lukács is very unfair.
Yeah, I mean, one could certainly imagine a kind of Marxist analysis of Madame Bovary that focuses on I mean, I think Lukács was not very interested in women characters, perhaps, that the
True.
novels that succeed in counting as primary examples for him are usually ones with male protagonists who are
exactly, and it's the same with Nana, right? Yeah. You're right. Yes, it's the same with Nana and Emma Bovary. Well, yeah.
No, I think that is a striking fact about. I mean, I suppose what to me is so striking is that Flaubert doesn't express empathy for, really, in life, empathy for women and their predicament, etc. And he does seem to feel it for Emma in a certain way. But the analysis where she really does become the center, and what's wrong with Yonville comes out really through her as opposed to through anybody else. I mean, it's satire of Homais, etc. But it's Emma's, in many ways, Emma's perspective on the village that gives us the critique of life in the provinces, which is very striking.
And, we might even suppose that there were so many other women like her, with the same kinds of expectations, dreams, desires, and with such an uninteresting, dull life, right?
Yes, I would think so. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to sort of hold. I think there are questions here. I suppose, Raphael, could you help us here? Because if we have questions from the floor, I don't. Okay, there you go. Thank you for the amazing lecture, Professor Culler. We're thinking about the notion of serious century, of the serious century used by Frank Moretti to describe the serious style in 19th century European novel.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that goes on. Do you think, Professor Culler, that Madame Bovary is an example of the seriousness that prevailed in the novel at the time?
I think it's a serious novel. There are different kinds of seriousness, of course. If you compare Flaubert and Balzac, which is has been what used to be anyway one of my favorite comparisons. They're both serious, certainly serious novelists. Balzac is determined to inform us about all aspects of French life and tell us how to recognize different types and give us, it's a highly pedagogical seriousness in a way that Flaubert's is not. Flaubert's leaves it, it very much left up to the reader to decide what to think about Emma Bovary, and whether this is a moral book or not, whether how far we sympathize with her, how far we dismiss her as creating her own problems and behaving foolishly, etc., or how usually for most readers, I imagine it's some kind of combination of the two. But Flaubert is not explicitly giving us lessons, and Balzac would never write a a line like Flaubert saying that, you know, in the all the time since this happened, nothing has happened and nothing has changed, and etc. Oh, Balzac always wants to tell us about what's changed now. You know, that used to be courtesans were like this, and now they are like this, or the advent of railways changes this, such and such. And Balzac is very eager to give us serious lessons about all aspects of 19th century French life. So different versions of seriousness, but it's true that there's some light sort of slight comic moments in here, but not very many. It's very much a serious novel of a serious century. Yeah.
Rafael, any other questions from the floor? Any? Well, what I can, yes, and now we have some comments, right? Well, Professor Moises she's also a retired professor. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She specializes in French literature, and she will be talking tomorrow. Tomorrow? Yeah. Sorry, I've got the program, but I don't have it right before me. So lots of thanks and lots of.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Yes.
So
one comment, if we have another moment. One thing I didn't expatiate on, but could have, because it was important in that long quotation from the Lucia di Lammermoor scene. One of the issues in the trial bore on really free and direct speech. One of the lines that the prosecution picked out as showing what an evil novel Madame Bovary was the line about the disillusion, the defilement of marriage and defilements of marriage and the dissolution of adultery, and said it should have been the opposite way. You could be disillusioned with marriage, but the adultery was the defilement, and that Flaubert should have written this just shows how immoral this was. Unfortunately, Sénard was not sufficiently not a good enough literary critic to say this is Emma's thoughts rather than
Flaubert's.
It's Emma and it's interesting that for Emma it sort of goes in passing. She was taking for granted she's been disillusioned with adultery. That's very much the way she feels, and marriage she feels has sort of defiled her, that she has no interest in Charles, etc. But it's just sort of in passing that she takes those things for granted. But Sénard defended it by arguing that yes, by trying to explain why Flaubert would have said these things, and etc. But that was there. You have style indirect libre, was not clear. Is it Emma or is it Flaubert? And that was important in the trial.
They were not students of literary theory, right? So they couldn't actually make the difference and understand that, when you have indirect speech, you can never say exactly who's speaking, who's sort of sharing their thoughts, and the ambiguity is there all the time. So it was unfair to Flaubert, right?
Flaubert still he was found innocent. I think partly because his family was respectable, and he was a respectable person. So Baudelaire's trial the same year, Baudelaire was found guilty, but he was a bohemian poet who had a bad reputation, etc.
And it's interesting how many writers were sort of sent to trial because of their work, right? I mean, we've got lots of them, many of them, and novels censored and all that. I think, well, that's a completely different sort of topic. But I mean, I think probably in this case, the sort of mixture of voices had a lot to do with, as you said. Had a lot to do with this misunderstanding that produced all the scandal, right?
Yes, that the novel is not explicitly condemning Emma for her
exactly
way, especially the fiacre scene at the cathedral when they are making love in the closed coach, and we're not told that we were led to imagine what's happening. We're we're only told about the frustration of the coachman who's continually being told to drive on, and et la lourde machine se mit en route, etc. But again, that was seen as a scandalous thing, that they're making love in the coach and coach.
But it's also interesting to think that the novel has always suffered from some kind of censorship from the very beginning, right? I mean, it's either on moral grounds mostly, but also sometimes on aesthetic grounds. But it's always been there at the center of all these discussions and things. It's interesting that, anyway. So by 1850 something, we might have expected people to have, some sort of acceptance of these things. But still, you mentioned Oscar Wilde, then we have D.H. Lawrence, then of course Ulysses was also banned for some time. So and this goes on and on and on, right? Yeah. Anyway, let me see if there are
in the United States, people are wanting to ban Toni Morrison because it's such a
for different reasons, right?
Race, yes, race.
Now, sorry, Elisa?
I tried to make a question here in the comments.
No,
and
do it.
It's absolutely confused. I think it's some kind of bug here.
What's your question
first
now?
of all, I'm a bit shy. That's why I prefer to write. Thanks for the speech. I'm very happy. Really, it's nice to see your enthusiasm with Flaubert. It's evident, I think, and it's evident in your book too. And well, I think that the part that I most liked is this the central tension, the tension you describe between Emma as a source of value and as an object of mockery. Yes, as a satire. It's a very, very, very ironic book. So this idea of this terrible irony don't match perfectly with this kind of democracy that some authors used to talk about the book and about Flaubert. And I think that's really a nice and, for me, profoundly confusing tension between these two things.
It's hard for us to imagine. Oops, there's an echo there. Hard for us to imagine any kind of satisfactory solution for Emma. Since
yes.
I don't know, brings Charles up to standard or something, gets him to be more interesting, or I don't know, or finds somebody else who's not Léon or like Rodolphe. I mean, her fantasies of what she wants are just so, sitting by a lagoon and riding gondolas in Venice and all that sort of thing, as opposed to trying to imagine what would be a more viable mode of life. Does she? Running away to Paris probably wouldn't work either. But it's hard. The concrete forms that her expressions, her wishes take are usually ridiculous, and yet we do sympathize with her dissatisfaction.
But I have two questions. So if I understood correctly, there is a mockery of bad taste that works as a critique of democratization, and I think I agree with that. And I believe that this mockery of commonplaces also works, for example, in Bovary and Pécuchet. And it's possible to understand it as a criticism of the democratization of education itself, maybe, if we put it in the limits. And my question is, can we see it as a critique of democratization itself, or is it a critique of bad taste? In other words, to bad readings. Is it a critique of bad readings, or is it a critique of the democratization?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think even today this is still a dilemma for us, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially academics. We tend to have democratic beliefs that everybody should have a right to their to the amusements and the pastimes that interest them, but we're still inclined to be rather disdainful of many people's choices with fantasy literature, or we think they should read better books, or etc. That sort of thing. So it is hard. It's hard to know how far our elitist. I mean, we like to think that it's just a critique of bad taste, as opposed to some kind of anti-democratic feeling. It's interesting to me. I mean, the case of Flaubert is a bit special because it's almost as though his commitment to the idea of a livre where a book where the subject is almost invisible, or where the subject is a trivial trivial person, shall we say, where it's seems perfectly sincere. To what extent that, and I think, and certainly people at the time, there were people at the time who connected this with democracy. Whether Flaubert himself had thought of that as those things as connected in any way, he certainly had anti-democratic inclinations, as I mentioned, saying to Louise Collet, I'm worth 20 voters of Croisset. On the other hand, I suspect many of us probably think that too. Even if we are committed to democracy, we still think that, you know, my voice is really worth 20 of these people who would vote for Trump or whatever. I think the problem is not one that goes away, but I think it's easy to cast a certain disdain for people one thinks of as in various ways inferior, to pretend that that's simply a complaint about bad taste. I mean, it's especially weird when you get a quotation like that long quotation from Flaubert where he's complaining about office furniture or, you know, things, or Macintoshes, as though these really, how horrible these things that he sees as false or pretentious or whatever. So it's weird, but yeah, it's an interesting problem.
Thanks. And I have this other very, very small question. I would like to hear you talk about the relationship between the idea of bêtise in Flaubert and the book about nothing.
Let's see. Yeah.
Very small question.
A small question. I have a whole chapter on the final chapter of my book is called Stupidity. Not Stupidity, which, I mean, Flaubert was very interested in stupidity. There are lots of, again, letters where he talks about how, and he says at one point, "Les chefs-d'œuvre sont bêtes," another quite famous quotation, that the real masterpieces are stupid, that they sort of just, I mean, it's this sense of impersonality, like the pyramid or something. It's like a monument, that it's, as opposed to something intelligent that is trying to teach you a lesson. The stupidity of masterpieces. But of course, and so Bovary Pécuchet is the best example of his interest in stupidity. The idea of writing a novel, a long novel, full of just basically the thoughts of two people who are not particularly intelligent and who want to collect information about everything and write it all down, etc. It's partly a critique of the modern world and a critique of people's claim to be intelligent about the world, but which he thinks of as stupid. The problem, as he says at one point, comment épingler la bêtise sans se déclarer intelligent? How do you mock stupidity? How do you when you épingler, when you pinpoint it, when you pinpoint if you're pinpointing stupidity and pointing it out, which he likes to do, you're implicitly declaring yourself intelligent by saying, you know, I can see that this is stupid, and he's not really wanting to do that. It's not an arrogance of intelligence trying to claim that I know how everything in the world really is, and I want to declare how stupid all these other people are. But it is, and there's certainly passages which cite stupidity as a value, as well as these masterpieces are stupid. That he gets excited about melon covers at one point, that things that people put on to protect their melons from weather and from birds. And he said, we had a big storm in Croisset last night, and really it was really exciting, and that the melon covers were all destroyed. Is there anything as stupid as a melon cover? So he's quite enthusiastic about these melon covers having been destroyed. Anyway, never mind. That's a slightly different kind of example, but he's very interested in the subject of stupidity. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And what's amazing is that he can make stupidity interesting.
He does. So his two, the Bovary Pécuchet, are quite fascinating. I think maybe the book could be a bit shorter, but it is.
Well, there's another question for you. That's Kelvin Falcão Klein. He asks, he starts by saying that he thought it was fascinating, your idea to trace the word rien throughout the novel, finding it inside the character, right? And inside the body of the character. So when you mentioned Charles' death at the end, yes. What other reflections could come out of this mapping out, let's say, of this particular word or this particular signifier throughout the novel? So what other reflections? So he's thinking of a sentence that comes along when Charles visits Emma's house before the wedding. So that's, and I think he quotes it in French. So I'm not going to, I'd rather not. Quand Charles vend au berceau. You can do that, right? You can do that better than I can, so please.
Okay. Quand Charles vint au berceau pour la première fois, elle se considérait comme fort désillusionnée, n'ayant plus rien à apprendre, ne devant plus rien sentir. So she's, yes, that's very interesting. So Emma seeing herself as, oh gosh, I should, my computer, I moved to a different room and my computer is telling me I need to plug this in or it will sleep soon. But I think we're probably almost over, so I will finish.
Now, yes, we are. We are almost over. So
that's very interesting that Emma is already seeing herself as disillusioned at this point and doesn't. She has nothing more to think, nothing more to learn. That's great. I hadn't thought of those examples, but it's strange that it does keep coming back when he's focusing on these people who are the center of his, or the villages, etc., the center of his novel, with rien, the nothingness at the heart of the thing. Of course, Emma then does it sort of start to imagine, that her marriage is going to make her happy, etc. But she's really depressed at coming back and just living on this farm.
Acho que o professor Culler caiu. Congelou aqui também.
Foi isso, então. Porque congelou. Ele disse que ele tinha que estar numa outra sala, que o computador dele estava avisando. E que ele ia... Então, provavelmente era mesmo... Bom, se ele não puder voltar, eu acho que... A gente nem teve a chance de agradecer a ele novamente. Mas, enfim, são os percalços dessas transmissões, não é? Você prestou atenção, né, que ele disse um pouquinho antes, que o computador estava avisando que ele tinha que estar numa outra sala, portanto ele devia ter mesmo um outro compromisso. Bom, lamento que tenha acontecido isso bem no finalzinho, porque ele acha que ainda estava respondendo a pergunta, mas tenho a impressão que para o Kelvin o que ele pôde responder já indicou mais ou menos, não é, o que ele tinha a dizer. Bom, eu vou, então, encerrar essa mesa, enfim, e convidar todos para que continuem assistindo os próximos... nós temos mais uma mesa às 5 da tarde, não é? Então, gostaria de lembrar...
ele voltou, professora.
Voltou? Voltou para vocês, voltou para mim ainda não.
Very sorry, it never occurred to me that this would run out of energy after an hour. Maybe that takes more energy to do a Zoom talk. Usually, I mean, when I go to the library, I'll take it and it's fine.
It does take much more energy. It does. So don't worry. I thought you had to go anyway because you said you had something else to do.
No, I said that I just had this message that my computer was going to quit unless I plugged it in, but I thought it would last a few more minutes anyway.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
But anyway, I don't know if you would like to finish your answer, or if you had I think you sort of answered it in some way.
No, I don't have any more to say about that, but it's a wonderful, it's a very good example of that. I could have plug that into my exposition with that. I didn't systematically go through the novel looking for all the nothings.
All the references.
It's partly the the final one with Charles is very striking because it's so compressed. Il l'ouvrit et ne trouva rien. I mean, it doesn't even say that he was doing an description of an
there was nothing inside. Right?
Nothing inside of it. That's the end. that's
the end. Yes.
It goes along very well with the idea of a book about nothing. But
so I think that there's also a word of thanks to you from Pedro Pereira. I think you can read it on your screen.
Yes.
So
yes,
it's about your book on deconstruction.
Okay. Well, very good. I'm glad.
It became one of the cornerstones of his studies. Yeah. So lots of people thanking you. And although I don't think you have ever come to Brazil.
No, I haven't. No,
you haven't. Well, but anyway, you see, you were present among us somehow. So it was a real pleasure to have you among us this afternoon. And thanks very much for
You're very welcome.
Sharing your thoughts with us.
As I say, it's always a pleasure to talk about Madame Bovary, and thank you for convening this. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'm also in a way saying here the lots of thanks around in the chat, and then I'm just transmitting them to you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
So goodbye, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Keep safe with the new variant, please.
Yes, indeed. Yes, try. You too. Okay. So goodbye.
Bye-bye. See you. Bye-bye.